18 gold trucks, one forgotten soldier, and a border where justice was never meant to arrive. Why did a young limping recruit from a nameless village dare to stop what even generals ignored? And what happened next shook the entire country. The wind arrived before the sound. It whispered through cracked millet stalks and curled around the broken edge of a dry well, dragging a veil of fine red dust behind it. The sky above was the color of bruised copper, not yet night, not quite day, just the long aching in-between that the village had learned to live with. The ground, tired from years of promises, never kept cracked in crooked veins beneath bare feet. And somewhere in that wind, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, was a boy who didn't speak. His name was Satu. No one ever said his name with pride or power. In a place where even the goats were more recognizable than the children, Satu was easy to forget. He spoke little, smiled less, and walked with a limp in his left leg, a shuffle really like one shoe always refused to follow the other. The village kids teased him sometimes, but mostly they ignored him. That he had learned was the sharpest kind of silence. He didn't mind, because while the others shouted and chased dust in circles, Sadu watched. At that moment, he was drawing something with a stick, not pictures, not letters, just lines. Lines that twisted like rivers, no longer flowing maps with no names, paths that started and ended in nowhere. The wind kept blowing, but he didn't flinch. The dust swirled around his ankles, coating his already torn pants, but he didn't move. Behind him stood the skeleton of a schoolhouse, its walls eaten by time, its roof patched with rusted tin and woven regrets. A few crooked desks remained, but no one came here anymore. The last teacher left during the planting season 3 years ago. No one replaced her. No one ever replaced anything in this village. It had a nickname, the place after the river. Even that was generous because the river had long since turned to stone. There was no name on any map, no signpost on any road. To the government, it was a forgotten coordinate, buried under dust and indifference. To Sadu, it was simply home. He stood slowly, one leg stiff, brushing the dirt from his palms. His gaze drifted to the sky, always watching for patterns. The birds had flown south early this year, and the wind too felt different. Not louder, just heavier. People in the village said wind carried voices, not the kind you could hear, but the kind that whispered inside your bones. Today it was whispering something Sadu didn't fully understand, but he felt it. Like the world had started turning in a direction no one was watching. Behind the hut, his grandfather's walking stick leaned against a post, worn from years of use and war, and above it, nailed to a cracked wooden beam, hung 3 faded military medals. No one had polished them in years. Dust clung to the curves of the metal like time refusing to forget. His grandfather Isufu hadn't spoken much since his lungs started failing, but when he did, Sadu listened like the words were gold. Justice isn't loud, Isufu had once told him, sitting by the well at dusk. It's not a shout. It's not a parade. It's a promise that refuses to die. Sadu never forgot that. A scream broke the silence behind him, a child tripping, scraping a knee. Mothers called from small mud homes, voices echoing without conviction. Someone was arguing about water again. A donkey cried in frustration. But none of it shook him. He was watching the sky again. Because something was wrong. Not in a way anyone else would notice. Not yet. But the dust wasn't falling like it used to. The smell of the air had changed. And yesterday a convoy of trucks passed on the far ridge, too clean, too quiet. No one else saw them, but Sadu saw everything. And in that moment, tracing lines in the dirt, he wasn't imagining anymore. He was remembering, preparing, measuring the wind the way his grandfather had taught him, counting the time between bird calls, scanning tire tracks by memory alone. Because while the world ignored the village, something had started moving under the dust. And though no one knew it yet, the smallest boy in the village, no one cared to name, was about to change the direction of a nation. Not with a weapon, not with a speech, but with a single quiet choice to not look away. Sadu's grandfather, Isufu, was a man of silence, but not because he had nothing to say. He simply believed most people listened with their mouths. While others wasted breath trying to be heard, Isufu mastered the language of stillness. He had the kind of presence that made even wind hesitate. Villagers didn't speak of him often, but when they did, it was always with a slight edge of respect and just enough fear. He had once been a soldier. That much everyone knew. His metals now dulled by sun and dust hung in a wooden box beneath his bed, wrapped in a faded red scarf. Some said he had marched through 3 countries. Others claimed he had trained with foreign armies. The truth, like most valuable things, lives somewhere between a fact and legend. But Sadhu never asked. He didn't need to. Each morning before the sun cracked the horizon, Sadhu would find his grandfather already awake, sitting on a low wooden stool with his eyes closed, facing the wind like it was an old friend whispering secrets. That was their classroom. No blackboard, no chalk, just the dust, the sky, and a mind honed by war and regret. One morning Sadhu had asked, "What are you listening to?" Isufu hadn't opened his eyes. The future, he said simply. That was the first lesson. The second came weeks later when Isufu placed a torn canvas map on the dirt floor. It was old, its edges frayed like burned paper, its colors faded into pale ghosts. Sadhu thought it was broken at first. There were no names, just lines, rivers that no longer existed, trails that twisted without explanation. But to Isufu, it was alive. He tapped the map with one knuckle. This, he said, is how they forget us. One line at a time. He taught Sadhu how to read without names, how to trace elevation by memory, how to sense where roads once were based on how the wind moved across grass. Isufu could smell a convoy from 5 kilometers away. He knew when trucks had passed by how the pebbles were scattered. To him, the world didn't speak in volume, it whispered in patterns. It was Sadhu's job to learn its language. At first, Sadhu struggled. His limp slowed him. His questions came clumsy and fast like a dam about to burst. But Isufu never raised his voice, never corrected with shame. He would simply glance up with those sharp, glassy eyes and say again, and Sadhu would try again. They trained not with weapons but with patience. Isufu would send him out to walk the same trail 10 times, asking each time, "What changed? What bird called? Where was the dog you heard yesterday? Why was the air thicker today than the last?" It was exhausting. But over time, Sadhu began to see. He saw how the goats moved slightly uphill before the first rains, how the ants avoided certain routes when the earth heated too fast. He started to understand that silence wasn't absence. It was a canvas. One evening, just as dusk pulled its curtain across the sky, Sadhu sat beside Isufu at the well. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The village behind them hummed with routine pots, clinking children, laughing the faint crackle of cooking oil. The wind, warm and unhurried, curled around them like a quiet witness. And then Isufu finally said the words that would brand themselves onto Sadhu's soul. "Justice isn't loud." He paused as if weighing the rest on his tongue. It's not a shout. It's not a performance. It's a presence. It doesn't need to be seen, it needs to be repeated. He tapped his own chest twice. Justice isn't loud. It's consistent. Sadhu nodded, not because he understood fully, but because something deep inside him recognized the weight of those words. He would carry them long after Isufu was gone. They would anchor him when the world turned confusing, when truth bent and twisted like smoke. In the distance, the wind changed, slightly, a shift too subtle for most. But Isufu stood. "The trucks will return soon," he murmured, his voice soft but certain. Sadhu glanced up. What trucks? Isufu didn't answer. He didn't need to. The lesson was already inside him. They came without warning. Not a horn, not a flag, not a single word in the wind to announce them. Just the low groan of unfamiliar engines and the crunch of oversized tires on brittle soil. By the time the villagers stepped out of their homes, blinking into the heat, the trucks were already there, 7 of them, at first matte gray with no insignia. Within days, more followed. By the end of the week, there were nearly 20. No one asked permission. No one offered explanation. They parked beside the dead riverbed just beyond the rusting water tower and unloaded equipment the villagers had never seen: machines with claws like steel insects, containers that hissed when opened, generators that growled through the night. Foreigners with hard hats and clipped voices walked in tight groups, pointing, measuring, recording. They didn't speak the local tongue and didn't care to try. The village chief, a man with cracked palms and sun-withered pride, went to speak with them once. He returned silent, eyes hollow. After that, no one asked anything. But Sadhu watched. He sat behind the half-toppled wall of the old schoolhouse, stick in hand, pretending to trace lines in the dirt. But his real focus was elsewhere, on the crates that arrived in the backs of the trucks, on the patterns of the guards' boots on the way. One man always stood facing the hills, never the machines. Every day he counted. Crates in, crates out. 4 more today than yesterday. One stack marked with 3 red lines. Another wrapped in chain. They worked at night mostly. Not because they had to, but because they could. Giant floodlights were set up around the digging site, humming like angry bees. From a distance, the place looked like a bone being peeled open. Sadhu once asked Isufu what they were looking for. The old man didn't answer. He only looked toward the trucks, then toward the sky, and back at Sadhu. That was answer enough. The village changed. At first subtly. Goats refused to graze near the machines. The well's water grew cloudy. The women fetching it stopped singing. Children were told not to wander near the site, but curiosity buzzed behind their eyes. No one smiled when the men in uniform walked past, not even the drunk ones. Then just as suddenly as they had come, they were gone. No announcement, no packed-up camp, no footprints even. One morning the trucks were simply not there. The floodlights sat cold and dead. The machine's silent husks in the dirt looked like they'd been dead for years. The villagers didn't celebrate. They just watched the empty space with the unease of someone waking from a fever dream, unsure what had been real and what had been stolen in the night. Sadhu stood near the edge of the site, looking at the tracks in the soil now half covered by windblown ash. He counted crates again, not the ones that remained, but the absence of those that had left. His lips pressed into a thin, thoughtful line. Beside him, Isufu arrived, slowly leaning on his stick. He didn't look at the machines. He didn't need to. He spat in the dust, voice dry as bark. "They didn't take our gold," he said. "They took our shame and called it progress." Then he turned and walked away. And for the first time in Sadhu's life, the wind felt like it had nothing left to say. The sun hadn't yet risen when Sadhu slipped a folded map into his shirt and stepped beyond the edge of the village. He didn't say goodbye. No one expected him to. In a place where leaving often meant never coming back, farewells were whispered only by the wind. He carried no pack, just a thin bag with 2 pieces of dry flatbread, a rusted compass, and a small cloth pouch that held one of Isufu's medals. Not as a token of pride, Sadhu had never seen his grandfather wear it, but as a reminder, a weight, a memory that clinked gently as he walked. The road was not really a road, just hardened earth lined with the ghosts of old tire tracks, the occasional broken fence post, and once the stripped skeleton of a bicycle half swallowed by weeds. He walked for 2 days through sun that pressed like fire, and nights where the cold chewed at his joints. He moved with his now familiar limp left foot dragging slightly, creating a subtle arc with each step. Strangers passed him on motorcycles and battered trucks, on donkey carts. No one offered a ride. No one asked why a boy walked alone toward the horizon with dust on his shoulders and determination in his silence. By the second night, his bread was gone, his lips cracked, and his left leg throbbed with dull fire. Still he walked. He had memorized every curve of the land from Isufu's stories. He knew how far to follow the shadow of the ridge before turning east toward the government checkpoint, where a weather-beaten sign leaned slightly to the left, Military Enlistment Republic Defense Forces. The gate was iron too big for its purpose, with a rusted chain that had long since stopped pretending to lock anything. A young soldier in a clean uniform glanced up from his post and narrowed his eyes. "You here to sweep the floors?" Sadhu said nothing. The soldier smirked. "Application forms are at the Capitol. This isn't a charity." Still, Sadhu said nothing. He handed over a folded letter, a referral written by a former teacher who once lived in his village, now long relocated to the city. The guard didn't even read it. He looked at Sadhu's leg, raised an eyebrow, and waved dismissively. "Next." Sadhu didn't move. He stood at attention, eyes fixed straight ahead, not defiant, just unshakably calm. For a moment the guard hesitated. Something about the boy's stillness unnerved him. Before he could say anything more, a voice from the nearby tent cut through the air. "Hold that one." The speaker was an older man, his uniform creased with experience, his face unreadable beneath a wide-brimmed cap. He stepped forward, slowly studying Sadhu, the way a hawk might study a sleeping mouse, not with cruelty, but with calculated interest. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sadhu." "That's all, yes, sir." The man tilted his head. You're limping. You know this isn't a hospital. Sadhu nodded once. I'm not here to heal. I'm here to learn. The officer smiled barely. You're quiet. Sadhu didn't answer. The man seemed to like that even more. Follow me, he said. They walked past the barracks where boys shouted and shoved and laughed too loudly, past the shooting range where new recruits tried to impress no one in particular, past the mess hall where food smelled like heat and fatigue. They stopped in front of a squat, windowless building with a faded sign barely legible under years of sun and dust. 7G, Field Intelligence Training. This is for those who don't fit the usual mold, the man said. The ones who think too much, talk too little, and notice what others miss. Sadhu said nothing, but his eyes scanned the building, its patterns, the guards' postures, the subtle wear on the doorframe. He was already gathering. The officer looked at him again, this time not like a child or a burden, but like a seed that might survive in difficult soil. You listen more than you speak. Sadhu nodded. Good, the man said. The truth tends to whisper. And with that, the door opened, and the boy from the forgotten village stepped into a place where silence finally had value. The inside of Barracks 7G smelled of sweat rust and tension. It was a squat concrete rectangle with 10 cots, 3 cracked windows, and no mirrors. Mirrors, as one instructor liked to say, only help soldiers admire what they hadn't earned yet. From the moment Sadhu stepped through the door, he became a target. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He never laughed at the crude jokes the others threw around. He ate slowly, eyes fixed on his tray, and limped without apology. In a place where dominance was often measured by volume, Sadhu was a threat without ever raising his voice. And that made some of the other recruits uneasy. They called him Shadow, sometimes Crutch. One boy, tall and loud, liked to whistle pity songs when Sadhu walked past. There was a push during drills, a trip during formation. Once someone smeared mud across his mattress. Sadhu never responded. He simply cleaned the mess, made his bed again, and returned to training as if nothing had happened. But what made him impossible to ignore wasn't how much he could endure, it was how much he could see. During one exercise, the recruits were asked to navigate an unfamiliar stretch of terrain with no compass and no markers. Most of the boys wandered in circles, blaming each other when they got lost. Sadhu, who had studied the land the night before by noting the wind, the slope of grass, and the pattern of the stars, arrived at the checkpoint 45 minutes early. He didn't celebrate. He simply waited, arms crossed, watching clouds roll in. Another time, during a mock infiltration drill, the objective was to retrieve a fake dossier from a guarded outpost without being seen. The others planned elaborate distractions, smoke noise, even fake fights. Sadhu walked in from the west, hugging the shade line of the barracks wall, timed the guards' coughs, and removed the file in silence. When the instructors checked the surveillance playback, no one saw when he took it. Later that night, someone shoved him in the mess hall. You think you're special, the boy snapped. Sadhu didn't answer. He only looked at him, not with defiance, but with an unnerving stillness that made the boy step back before he even realized it. Instructors began to take note. Captain Mbeki, the intelligence trainer who had first spotted Sadhu at the gate, started assigning him more complex strategy problems, map-based puzzles, multi-team scenarios, simulations with incomplete data. Sadhu completed them all with eerie precision. One evening during a particularly brutal rainstorm, Becky called him into a small operations room behind the training field. The room was filled with maps, tacked reports, and old radio equipment. Tell me, Becky said, pointing at a section of terrain from the western provinces. If you had 4 operatives, limited ammo, no visibility, and 2 hours to intercept a smuggling route here, he tapped twice, what would you do? Sadhu leaned in. He didn't guess. He traced. He pointed out windbreaks in the terrain, noted the likely tire depth of heavy trucks, predicted which hours guards would be most exhausted based on natural light and recent patterns. He even suggested a fallback point 2 ridgelines south in case the mission failed. When he finished, Mbeki didn't say anything for a long time. Then finally, who taught you to see like that, my grandfather, Sadhu replied. Mbeki nodded slowly. He taught you well? Words spread quietly through the ranks. Some began to glance at Sadhu differently. No one said anything out loud, but the mockery lessened. His cot stayed clean. During meals, some nodded at him as they passed. Instructors called on him more not out of kindness but curiosity. Respect in 7G didn't arrive with cheers. It came quietly like dust settling after a storm. And for the first time, Sadhu felt something shifting, not in the way people treated him, but in the space he occupied within their silence. He hadn't asked to be seen, but now they were looking. And more importantly, they were listening. The summons came before dawn. No trumpet, no formation. Just a folded slip of paper left on the corner of Sadhu's cot, the ink already bleeding from the morning humidity. It contained no signature, only a time, a room number, and one word printed in bold, confidential. He arrived at the briefing chamber 15 minutes early. The room was dim lit only by a swinging bulb overhead and the soft blue glow of a topographic map displayed on the wall. Captain Mbeki was already there, seated with a folder in his lap, and the same unreadable calm that had shadowed him since day one. Sadhu stood at attention. At ease, Mbeki said, "You're not here for ceremony." He set the folder on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, grainy, taken from a distance. Convoys, remote roads, men in uniform loading crates into trucks under the cover of night. No logos, no national flags, only shadows doing quiet things in quiet places. "This is called Mission Sentinel Watch," Mbeki said. "It's not on the books. No medals, no headlines. Just eyes in the right places at the right time." Sadhu leaned forward, absorbing the images without speaking. The roads were familiar not by name but by shape. He could already feel the dust in his throat, the wind carving those curves in memory. "You'll be stationed at Border Outpost 45, 2 kilometers south of the old mining corridor," Mbeki continued. "You'll travel alone. You won't wear insignia. You won't speak unless spoken to." He slid a sealed envelope across the table. It was thick, wax-stamped, and ominously silent. "You'll open this only when you reach the checkpoint," Mbeki instructed. Not before. Then came the map, hand-drawn, faded, marked with annotations only someone trained to read wind and terrain could decipher. No GPS, no digital trail. This wasn't a mission built for soldiers with radios and satellite feeds. It was built for someone who could disappear and still see everything. Mbeki studied Sadhu for a long moment. "You're being sent not because you're fast or loud or strong," he said. "You're being sent because you notice what others overlook, and because when something feels wrong, you don't look away." Sadhu nodded, his face unreadable. As Mbeki stood, his tone shifted, quieter, heavier. "There are things happening near that border that will never make the news," he said. "Stories that never find paper. Real ones. Ugly ones. What you're about to witness may not be illegal on paper, but it will feel wrong in your bones." He paused. "You'll see what the news won't show." Then, with no further words, he handed Sadhu a canvas pouch. Inside, a compact field lens, a water flask, 2 protein bars, and a folded note that simply read, "Trust your eyes. Doubt their silence." Sadhu tucked the envelope under his shirt, the map into his pocket, and stepped out into the early light. No one clapped. No one saluted. But as the sun stretched its fingers across the eastern ridge, a boy from a forgotten village walked toward the edge of a nation's truth, not as a hero, not as a soldier, but as a witness. And in the silence that followed, only the dust moved. At the border checkpoint near Jibo, the wind carried the scent of iron and waiting. It was dry with a fine layer of red dust, clinging to everything, to the boots of the guards, the rusted hinges of the boom gate, even the cracked lips of the officers who barely looked up from their posts. Here boredom had worn the edges off discipline. Paperwork moved slower than clouds, and routine became religion, until the trucks arrived. They came just before midday, when the sun was highest and the wind meanest, 18 of them in perfect formation, each spaced exactly 5 meters apart, as if marching to a silent metronome. The convoy appeared over the southern ridge like ghosts materializing from heat waves. No sirens, no military escort. Just rolling metal and the distant hum of synchronized engines. At first, no one moved. Even the gate guard, slouched in a plastic chair with a rifle across his lap, blinked in disbelief. Aid convoys were never this large. Smugglers never this bold. There had been no radio call, no pre-clearance notice. Just trucks. Sadhu was already watching. He stood half-shaded beneath the crumbling watchtower eyes, hidden beneath the rim of his cap body still. To any outsider, he looked like a junior assistant or supply clerk, forgettable by design. But his gaze missed nothing. The trucks were unmarked. No logos, no license plates. Their canvas covers were a muted gray, the kind designed to look invisible in dust, but somehow appeared too clean, too untouched. Sadhu's eyes drifted to the tires, thick, reinforced, pristine. That was the first red flag. Every vehicle that crossed this border wore the land like a second skin. Dust caked onto the wheels, crusted into the undercarriage, streaked across the windshields. But these were spotless, not even mud on the tread. The rubber still gleamed like it had come straight from a factory. The second detail came in the pattern. Each truck had the exact same wear on its rear mud flap, a diagonal tear in the canvas, at the same location as if intentionally replicated. The tarp knots were uniform right down to the tension in the tie strings. Whoever packed them hadn't just been efficient, they'd been trained. The third detail was more subtle. As the lead truck pulled to a halt, the driver didn't ask to be let through. He simply opened the door, walked around the vehicle once, then returned to his seat. Like he'd done this a dozen times before, like he expected no resistance, and he got none. The border captain emerged from the main office after the fourth truck rolled in, waving off the guards who reached for their logs. Pre-cleared, he muttered, though no one had seen any clearance orders. He barely looked at the convoy before retreating inside. Sadhu didn't blink. He slipped into the side shed, removed the sealed envelope from his inner pocket, and opened it carefully. Inside was a printed instruction sheet with a single handwritten note scrawled at the bottom in red ink track patterns. Count quietly. Record everything. So he did. He began counting crates as best he could, noting the vibration of each truck as it rolled past, marking down the ones that seemed heavier, based on tire pressure and engine strain. His eyes moved over each driver's face, all different, yet somehow rehearsed. Expressions neutral. Posture identical. Truck 6 was carrying something dense. Axle dipped half a degree lower than the rest. Truck 11 had an armed escort inside the passenger cab, a faint gleam of a barrel against tinted glass. Truck 14's rear door rattled once, briefly, like something inside had shifted on its own. By the time the 18th truck passed, Sadhu had filled 4 pages of micro-observations. Nothing he could prove. Everything he could feel. He slipped the notes beneath a loose panel in the floor of the watchtower and returned to his post just as the wind picked up again, heavier now, like it too had witnessed something it couldn't explain. No one else questioned the convoy, but Sadhu had seen too much to call it routine. And though the paperwork would say nothing happened that day, the dust told another story. Something had passed through this border, too quiet, too perfect, and far too valuable to be aid. It happened during the 12th truck. The sun had just begun its descent, casting long shadows across the checkpoint and bleeding orange into the dust-filled air. Guards wiped sweat from their foreheads with lazy hands. The convoy, still crawling through in sequence, had lulled the outpost into a rhythm, that dangerous kind of rhythm where no one bothers to think. A junior officer stood by the gate, clipboard in hand, barely looking up. Another sat slouched against the concrete barrier, fingers tracing the rim of an empty teacup. Eyes glazed, protocol slipping. Sadhu, however, was wide awake. He had been watching tire pressure changes with each passing truck, counting the seconds between stop-and-go movements, noting the imperceptible delays in acceleration. And truck 12, unlike the others, had hesitated for precisely 4 seconds before reaching the checkpoint line. No one else noticed. Sadhu approached slowly, keeping his voice level. "Sir," he said, addressing the ranking officer on duty, "request permission to inspect the third axle of truck 12. The officer turned confused. "The third what?" Sadhu pointed, unflinching. "The third axle. Rear section. There's added weight, unnatural sag in the left suspension, enough to suggest concealed mass beneath the main cargo floor." A silence fell. 2 guards chuckled under their breath. "You think you're smarter than the scanners now, kid," one of them muttered. But the officer squinted toward the truck. Maybe it was the way Sadhu stood calm, certain without the defensiveness of someone guessing. Maybe it was the way the air shifted heavy with things unsaid. Or maybe it was the fatigue in the officer's eyes, finally craving something to break the monotony. "Driver," he called, stepping toward the cab. "Kill the engine. Open the rear." The driver hesitated, just a blink too long, and that was enough. 2 guards moved forward. The tarp was peeled back. Crates neatly stacked and labeled as medical aid, drought region filled the space. Nothing unusual, until one guard reached toward the back wall and tapped twice a hollow sound where there should have been solid wood. "Get a crowbar," the officer said. 10 seconds later, the panel cracked open, and there it was. Dozens, no hundreds of gold bars wrapped in burlap and foam packed with such precision it looked like they had been poured directly into the frame. No serial numbers, no stamps. Just weight dull shine and silence. But Sadhu wasn't looking at the gold. He was watching the underside of the panel they had just removed, because hidden there, fastened neatly behind the foam insulation, was a small black box no larger than a fist with a blinking red light and a tiny antenna. A GPS tracker, the kind used by private security firms, or militaries, or people who didn't trust even their own smuggling routes. Sadhu leaned closer. "It's broadcasting live," he said, voice steady. "Someone's watching this checkpoint right now." The air shifted again, this time sharper, more alert. The officer cursed under his breath, grabbing his radio. "Lock down the gate. Nobody moves, nobody leaves. Get surveillance offline now." Chaos stirred like a kicked hive. Guards scrambled. The driver was pulled from the cab, shouting something in a dialect no one recognized. Other truck drivers began shifting in their seats. One even reversed slightly, trying to distance himself. But Sadhu stayed where he was, eyes scanning the ridgeline beyond the border, where a glint of glass flashed once briefly before disappearing into the haze. They had been watched. Not just today, maybe, for days, weeks. Maybe since the first truck rolled in. And now that the gold had been found, someone out there knew it. Sadhu turned away from the truck, his pulse steady, even as the checkpoint erupted around him. He wasn't thinking about medals or headlines. He was thinking about what came next. Because if this much gold had passed silently through a forgotten outpost, how much had already gotten through? And more importantly, who had let it happen? The checkpoint was still a battlefield of motion guards barking orders, trucks frozen midline radios, screeching incomplete commands when the coded message came through. A burst of static, then calm and cold, retrieval ETA. 10 minutes, sweep protocol theta. The line cut. The officer holding the radio went pale. "Sweep protocol," he whispered. "They're coming to erase it. Wipe the scene." No one needed clarification. Retrieval didn't mean assistance. It meant silence, forced and permanent, and somewhere beyond the hills they were already on the way. Sadhu didn't wait for orders. He moved fast, bypassing the internal comms channel and slipping into the auxiliary relay system wired into the back of the old communications shack. A rusted panel flipped open with a firm tug. Behind it, a forgotten long-range analog dialer still functioning, connected not to satellites but to land-based towers rarely used anymore. He adjusted the frequency manually. His fingers trembled not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. Then he leaned close to the mic and spoke clearly. Not in French, not in military code, not in English, but in Dula, his grandmother's tongue. A language of fields of songs of warnings whispered through millet rows and cracked walls. A language not written down but passed from elder to child, like fire in the dark. "Black tires coming," he said. "Block the veins. 10 minutes. No noise." He repeated it only once. Then he sat back, listening to the empty crackle of static. The wind had returned, still dry but charged now like it carried sparks in the dust. 10 kilometers south, an old man paused mid-step in a cassava field, eyes narrowing as he tilted his head toward the trees. 5 words in Dula. He'd heard them before decades ago during the grain seizure raids. He turned and began walking. Across the plateau, 3 teenagers repairing a motorbike heard the message over a buried radio, its signal distorted but unmistakable. They didn't ask who sent it. They didn't question if it was real. They simply moved. From village to village, over hills and through dry riverbeds, the people responded not with violence but with the quiet, powerful rhythm of those who remembered what silence cost. At checkpoint 47, ox carts were dragged sideways across the road. Boulders were rolled from cliff edges. Bicycles laid across gravel lanes. And in the middle of it all stood farmers, grandmothers, teachers, and children, not armed but unmoving. When the first black SUV appeared on the ridge, it stopped. Behind it, another and another. Tinted windows, government plates, engines purring like wolves sniffing for weakness. But the road was blocked, and not just with objects, but with presence. A dozen villagers stood like stones. No anger in their faces, no signs, no chants. Just quiet refusal. The SUVs idled for a moment, then reversed. At the checkpoint, the radio fell silent. Sadhu exhaled slowly, his face blank, but his hands still tense. Around him, the guards began to realize something extraordinary had just occurred, not because of a firefight or a high-ranking order or foreign intervention, but because someone had spoken and people had listened. Not through politics, not through broadcast, through a language no one thought mattered anymore. And in that moment, surrounded by crates of stolen gold and echoes of command, Sadhu understood what his grandfather meant. Justice isn't loud, it's consistent. Today, justice had spoken in Dula, and the nation had listened, even if only for 10 minutes. But sometimes, 10 minutes is enough to stop a machine. The capital was too clean. That was Sadhu's first thought as he stepped from the armored vehicle onto marble steps, scrubbed spotless beneath a noon sun. The dust from the border had long been shaken from his boots, but somehow the absence of dirt here felt louder than all the engines at the checkpoint. Everything gleamed. Everything echoed, yet nothing felt alive. He was led through long halls by a silent escort, past guards in polished uniforms and secretaries who didn't meet his eyes. They walked until the sound of the city disappeared behind thick walls, and the only thing Sadhu could hear was the tap of leather shoes on polished floor. Finally, a large oak door opened, and he was ushered into a room that was both simple and impossible. No flags, no gold, just bookshelves, closed windows, and a man sitting alone at a wide desk. The president. He didn't rise. He simply looked at Sadhu not with superiority, but with the calm, tired gaze of someone who had read too many reports and believed too few of them. "You're the boy who stopped the trucks," he said. Sadhu didn't reply. He didn't need to. The truth hung in the air between them, quiet and undeniable. The president studied him for a moment longer, then opened the drawer beside him and retrieved a thick-sealed envelope, its wax stamped not with the seal of the Republic, but with a faded crest Sadhu didn't recognize. He slid it across the desk. "There's someone we need," the president said. "Someone who once believed in the law more than comfort. A woman who was silenced because her questions were louder than our answers." He leaned back. "She was a judge, a fierce one, honest enough to be dangerous. We didn't jail her because she hadn't broken any laws. We just made her disappear." Sadhu picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. "What's in here?" he asked. The president folded his hands. "A summary of what you've seen, names, documents, patterns, and one final request. If she accepts, she'll lead the tribunal, not for the public, not for politics, for the record, for the future." Sadhu hesitated. "And if she refuses, then we lose the only person who remembers what justice used to sound like." The next morning, Sadhu boarded a northbound train with the envelope tucked inside his coat. He traveled for hours through the dry highlands, past hills where children chased goats, past villages with broken fences and no schools. The deeper he went, the more the country looked like the truth again. He found her in a town with no name on official maps, a quiet place where power lines ended and roads turned to rock. She lived alone in a mud brick house with blue shutters surrounded by silence and chickens. Her name was Madame Aminata Kita. When Sadhu arrived, she was sitting outside under a neem tree, weaving a mat with fingers so practiced they never paused to greet him. "You're early," she said without looking up. "You knew I'd come. I knew someone would." Sadhu handed her the envelope. She opened it slowly, reading each page without blinking. The sun moved across the sky. Birds came and went. Still she read. When she finally finished, she set the papers down gently on her lap and looked at Sadhu for the first time. "You didn't shoot anyone," she said. "No, you didn't run. No, and you used a language no one records." Sadhu nodded. She smiled not with warmth, but with recognition. "They thought silence would erase us," she said. "But they forgot silence isn't emptiness. It's storage." She stood brushing dust from her skirt. "I'll come with you," she said, "but not to serve them, to remind them." Sadhu said nothing, but something in his chest eased for the first time in weeks. For the first time, it felt like the weight of truth didn't rest on him alone. And in the distance, the wind moved again, not in warning, but in welcome. Her home was small, but her records were vast. Notebooks, folders, boxes marked with faint dates and brittle tags filled every corner of the one-room house. They lined shelves above the stove, spilled onto her sleeping mat, even gathered in crates stacked beneath the dining bench. To anyone else, it looked like the chaos of an old woman clinging to a past long buried. But to Sadhu, it was something else entirely, a court that had never closed. Madame Aminata Kita moved among her papers like a librarian of memory. Her hands, though wrinkled, turned pages with reverence. Her eyes, sharp behind thick glasses, flicked across legal codes and field reports with the same precision as a sniper tracking a target. On the second day of his visit, she finally told him the story. It was a land rights petition, she said, placing a faded case file onto the table. Filed by 4 villages near the Tangara Basin, where the government had approved exploratory mining licenses without consultation. The application came through quietly, of course. For development, they said. Always for development. She tapped the name of the company at the top of the form, Kalimba Holdings, the same name Sadhu had seen stamped on one of the internal manifests tucked in the back of his own envelope. I blocked the permit, she continued. Cited improper disclosure, violation of cultural land boundaries, absence of environmental review. Basic principles. Things that used to mean something. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble, but the air around her grew heavier with each sentence. 2 weeks later, I was reassigned. No trial, no explanation. My office was sealed. My junior clerks were warned. One of them disappeared. Sadhu sat quietly, absorbing the weight of her words without interrupting. It wasn't anger in her tone. It was history spoken like a hymn, steady and undeniable. I kept copies, she said, motioning to a dusty crate beneath the stove. I shouldn't have, but something told me justice doesn't always follow the right calendar. Inside the crate were signed affidavits, satellite images, internal memos, all pieces of a puzzle no one had ever been allowed to complete. For over a decade, they had stayed in this room, waiting, not for noise, but for truth to arrive without an agenda. Sadhu spent hours reviewing them, cross-referencing notes from his own mission, confirming links between truck movements and dormant mining zones. The patterns weren't just familiar, they were exact. What had begun as suspicion was now rooted in something far stronger. When he looked up from the files, Madame Kita was watching him. "You're not the first to knock on my door," she said. Sadhu met her eyes, but maybe the first who didn't ask for a headline. She nodded slowly. "You came with questions, not speeches. You came with truth, not politics. That's why I'm still listening." There was a long silence. Then she reached for a yellowed envelope sealed in wax and marked unsubmitted in her own handwriting. She set it before him like an offering. "I wrote this years ago, a full report, drafted for court submission. I never filed it. I thought maybe the truth would break something worse than the law." Sadhu touched the seal gently. "May I read it?" She nodded. "You may carry it." Outside, the wind had shifted. Again. Inside, 2 people, separated by age yet bound by silence, sat beside stacks of truth, no longer willing to be ignored. And somewhere between them, justice stirred from its long sleep, not in thunder, but in the quiet rustle of a paper finally ready to be opened. The smoke was still rising when Sadhu arrived. He had borrowed a motorcycle from the local district office, following the dry trail back to his village under the weight of a message that arrived without a name. Only 5 words written in red chalk on the side of a postal van. "They've come. Your house, ashes." He knew before he saw it. The air was thick with soot and memory. His childhood home, once quiet and crooked and full of dust-colored warmth, was now nothing but scorched bones, charred wood, twisted tin sheets, the stone hearth shattered from heat. Neighbors stood at a distance, silent, their expressions caught between fear and pity. No one offered condolences. No one claimed to know who had done it, because everyone knew who hadn't stopped it. Sadhu didn't speak. He moved carefully through the wreckage, stepping over broken beams and blackened cooking pots. The scent of burnt cloth and old earth clung to everything. Yet beneath the destruction, he searched not for what could be saved, but for what might have been left behind. He reached what remained of the small alcove behind the cooking fire, where his sufu used to store fishing lines and dried tobacco leaves in glass jars. The wall was collapsed, but something resisted under the ash, something harder than burnt wood. A metal tin warped but intact buried beneath a flat stone. Sadhu pried it open with his bare hands. Inside, a sealed oilskin wrap, brittle from age but protected from the fire. And inside that, a map hand-drawn in fine ink and colored with faded red charcoal, the kind his grandfather used only for the most serious tracking. But this wasn't a map of terrain. Not exactly. It was a map of people. Each village marked not with elevation or crops, but with initials and symbols, notations and a private code Sadhu recognized from his childhood lessons. Dots connected through arrows and question marks, some names circled, others crossed out. At the bottom, a date 1974. His hands tightened around the edge of the paper. This wasn't just a map of land. It was a timeline of corruption routes, of mining approval, militia movements, foreign company land purchases that had been masked as development projects for over 40 years. Names that had vanished from government reports, locations that had been relocated after natural disasters, companies that rebranded and returned under new logos, and connecting them all, a slow, patient network of quiet theft disguised as progress. And his grandfather, the quiet, limping man who smoked rolled leaves and taught him to listen, had seen it all, had tracked it, and kept it hidden. Not out of fear, out of timing. Because some truths can't survive exposure, they must wait until someone knows how to carry them. Behind him, the wind picked up, scattering flakes of ash into the sky. A gust passed through what was left of the threshold, as if the house was releasing its final breath. Sadhu stood in the ruins, the map trembling in his hands, fire still smoldering in his lungs. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He simply folded the map, placed it inside his coat, and stepped out of the ruin, no longer as a witness, but as a continuation. Because Isufu hadn't left him words. He had left him a trail. The National Council Hall was colder than Sadhu expected, not in temperature, but in the way sound disappeared inside it. Everything in the chamber seemed designed to mute: the thick velvet drapes, the polished teak floors, the semicircle of aged men in suits who leaned back in their chairs like they'd seen too much to be impressed anymore. They didn't look at him as he entered. Not really. Their eyes skimmed his uniform, still dusty from the road, then returned to their papers, their murmurs, their own certainties. He stood alone at the center, facing the council. Somewhere behind him, Madame Kita sat in the gallery, her arms crossed, her face still as stone. He didn't need to look back to feel her presence. She was here not as a shield, but as a witness. The speaker cleared his throat, slow and disinterested. "Proceed, soldier." Sadhu's voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried. "I am not here to ask for medals or favors," he said. "I came because a border checkpoint recorded silence, and I listened to it." A few heads turned. A few pens stopped scribbling. He reached into his coat and unfolded the map slowly, deliberately laying it out on the council's central table, covering their polished mahogany with lines drawn in red charcoal and fading ink. "This map," he said, "was drawn by a man who was never invited to speak here. He walked the lands your offices forgot. He listened where no radios reached. And he wrote what he saw because he believed the day would come when someone would need to remember." He placed a finger on the circled point nearest the southern ridge. "This map knew my village," he said, his voice hardening, "even when the government didn't." A ripple passed through the room. He began pointing to the marks: a mining deal near Tangara Basin approved under 3 different names, a smuggling route that changed cargo from medical supplies to military-grade components overnight, a company dissolved, then reformed under another holding with the same directors, all drawn decades ago. All verified line by line through what he had uncovered at the checkpoint, what Madame Kita had stored in her crates, and what the silence of villagers had long known but never been asked. "You've heard the word corruption," he continued. "You've filed reports, signed papers, held panels. But this," he tapped the map, "is not corruption. It's design. It's not an accident that my village had no name in your files. It's a pattern, one that lets gold move out while people disappear in." An older councilman leaned forward. "Do you have proof that this map is authentic?" Sadhu didn't flinch. "Do you have proof it isn't?" he asked. No one answered. A longer silence followed. Then Sadhu stepped back from the table. "I didn't come to convince you," he said. "I came so this map could be seen, so that for once the truth isn't whispered in huts or buried in fire. He looked each man in the eye. "And if nothing changes after today, that's your choice. But you will never again be able to say, 'We didn't know.'" He left the map on the table, did not roll it up, did not reclaim it, because some truths once laid bare are no longer yours to carry alone. As he turned to leave, a door at the far end opened quietly, not wide, but enough. A young council aide stepped inside, whispered something into the speaker's ear. The speaker frowned, then looked at the map, and for the first time that day, he didn't blink. The next time Sadhu stood before the council, he did not come alone. Behind him stood Madam Kita village elders from Tangara and Jibo, a student representative from the northern plateau, and a small woman named Nene Dalla, who had once dragged her ox cart into the path of a black SUV and refused to move. This time the room did not feel as cold, but it was no less hostile. The speaker's voice was clipped. "You are requesting the floor to propose a legislative motion?" "Yes," Sadhu replied. He unrolled a single scroll, handwritten, signed by over 30 civil leaders from across the provinces. The proposal was simple. Any material, mineral, or monetary asset seized at the nation's borders through illegal or unauthorized transport shall be declared by law the property of the people, not the state. There was silence, then outrage. "Impossible," a former finance minister muttered. "This would bankrupt our agencies," said another. "It's socialism cloaked in vigilante theater," someone near the back whispered. The room surged with rebuttals, crosstalk, the clatter of nameplates slapped in frustration. Sadhu stood still through it all. He did not raise his voice. He waited. When the noise softened, he took one step forward and spoke, not with defiance but with clarity. "For decades you've told us we were poor," he said, "that there wasn't enough. That development takes time. That patience is patriotic." He gestured toward the map that still hung behind the council bench, the one he had laid out days before. "But gold moved through our veins while our children drank from rusted wells. Our roads were empty, but trucks found their way in the dark. We didn't lose wealth, we bled it." He paused. "And now we hold the bandage." A few members sat back in their chairs, not because they agreed, but because they understood the moment would not dissolve with silence. Sadhu continued. "This law is not revenge. It's recognition that what is taken in secret must be returned in the open, that no minister, no agency, no foreign investor will again claim what belongs to the people without the people being asked." He turned toward the gallery where more villagers were now watching. Students, journalists, survivors of land seizures, children too young to speak but old enough to understand stolen futures. "This isn't about gold," he said. "It's about memory and price. And finally, saying the story changes here." The speaker looked down at the motion fingers, tracing the ink slow and contemplative. "The council will deliberate," he said, but the words lacked their usual weight, because for the first time, they weren't the only voices in the room. Outside, as Sadhu stepped from the marble steps, the press waited. Not with microphones, but with cameras, silent, wide-eyed, and recording a soldier with no medals proposing a law with no precedent. He said nothing. He simply held up the motion scroll and nodded once. And that image, one man, one paper, one truth, would be the one they replayed for years long after the law passed. Long after silence was no longer policy. The day of the vote began without ceremony. No anthems played, no flags raised. The council hall was quieter than usual. Like the air itself understood that history didn't need a drum roll. It only needed a line drawn. Sadhu sat in the rear, not at the front, not beside ministers or generals. He chose a wooden bench near the gallery window, the same one Madame Kita had sat in weeks before. He carried nothing but a folded copy of the proposal, now smudged with fingerprints from every hand that had passed it forward. The speaker stood, cleared his throat, and called the motion. There was no debate, just a slow, deliberate calling of names. Each council member rose one by one, their voices stripped of performance. Yes, yes. Abstain. Yes, yes. It continued like that, steady and irreversible, like drops of water into stone. Even those who had once scoffed now nodded, not out of conversion, but concession, because something in the country had shifted. And to vote no now wasn't just cowardice, it was exposure. When the final name was called and the speaker announced the majority, there was no thunder of applause. Only a soft wave of breaths, relief, reverence, recognition. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for celebration, only remembrance. Sadhu didn't smile. He didn't move. He simply looked down at his hands calloused and still scarred from the checkpoint fire and whispered under his breath, "He'd have liked this, Isufu." That evening, as dusk crawled across the city and the sky bruised into indigo, Sadhu returned to the small government quarters assigned to him, a one-room flat above a ration store, quiet and forgettable. Just how he liked it. The note was waiting on the floor, folded in thirds. No envelope, no signature. The handwriting was too neat, the paper too clean. He opened it with one hand slowly, as if the paper might bite. "You're not untouchable. Leave it alone, or we'll finish what the fire couldn't." There was no blood, no bullet. Just ink and the weight of its promise. Sadhu folded the paper, placed it on the table beside his sleeping mat, and lit a small oil lamp. He didn't call anyone, didn't report it, because something inside him had changed. Before he walked with silence because he had no choice. Now he walked with it because it terrified the ones who lived in shadows, and he would not run from that fear. Not now, not with the law passed, not with the country watching, not when there were still names on the map, names not yet crossed out. The old courthouse had not changed. The pillars were still chipped near the base. The high wooden doors still creaked when pushed, and the benches hard, narrow, unforgiving remained, as they were when Madame Aminata Kita last sat behind the judge's bench 12 years ago. But today it wasn't the building that mattered. It was who was inside it. No television crews. No reporters shoved behind velvet ropes. No political banners. Only rows upon rows of ordinary people, farmers in sand-stained tunics, students clutching notebooks, mothers holding babies who would never know the silence their parents once endured. No one cheered. No one chanted. They came not for spectacle, but to see justice breathe again. At the center of the room stood 5 men, all executives, all former directors of entities that at one point or another had passed through the names Kalimba Holdings, Afromet Southern Axis Logistics, or Karoo Export Limited, all dressed in charcoal gray suits that seemed increasingly out of place in a room filled with clay-colored sandals and eyes that had seen too much. Madame Kita entered through the side door. She wore no robe, no wig, only a white linen dress, crisp but plain. Her steps were slow but certain, her posture upright as if time had passed, but her spine had remained in defiance of it. The room rose to its feet in silence. She did not acknowledge it with a wave nor a nod, only with a soft, almost whispered, "Be seated." As she took her place behind the bench, the gavel rested untouched beside her, a symbolic relic. She didn't need to strike it. Her voice would do. The prosecutor stood, papers in hand. "Madam President, we are prepared to present evidence that these 5 defendants between the years 2006 and 2023 conspired with foreign interests, falsified export documentation, and enabled the unauthorized extraction and transport of national resources amounting to over 2.4 billion francs in undeclared gold." Kita didn't blink. "Proceed," she said. And so it began. Documents were read, ledgers displayed, truck logs matched with border footage, handwritten memos uncovered in basements and dusty file drawers now held up in the light. One by one, the paper trail of plunder, once invisible, was laid bare like bones on dry earth. But it wasn't the evidence that shook the room. It was the witnesses. An old man who had once scrubbed license plates for convoy drivers stepped forward, shaking but determined. A former customs agent confessed to unofficial orders handed down on torn napkins. Even a young woman once employed as an admin assistant revealed the shredded documents she secretly taped back together at night, afraid but unwilling to forget. Each story wasn't loud. It was consistent. At the end of the first day, as the courtroom emptied into a copper twilight, Sadhu remained seated in the far back, watching the woman who had once been erased by silence now command a room with only presence and truth. Madame Kita stood, collected her notes, and as she stepped down from the bench, her eyes met his for the briefest moment. She gave a single nod. Not of thanks, but of recognition, because justice wasn't back. It had simply never stopped waiting. On the second day of the trial, the defense found its rhythm. They didn't deny the convoys, or the mining, or the gold. That part was too well documented now, too tightly woven into the testimonies and the maps and the truck manifests. Instead, they reframed it. They called it strategic extraction, They called it development partnerships. They called it foreign investment structured to bypass bureaucratic bottlenecks in favor of economic acceleration. One lawyer, impeccably dressed and unflinchingly calm, looked toward the gallery as he spoke, gesturing with careful hands like a man performing for both judge and history. Our clients did not steal, he said smoothly. They facilitated opportunity. They took risks where others hesitated. They brought in infrastructure employment and global engagement. We are not on trial for theft, Your Honor. We are on trial for having succeeded too quietly. A low murmur passed through the room, not from anger, but from disbelief. The kind of sound that comes when someone tries to rename a wound as a favor. Madame Kita didn't flinch. She let the room settle. Then she reached beneath her bench and lifted something into view wrapped in cloth, the color of desert dusk. She unwrapped it slowly, carefully. A gold bar dull at the edges, its surface still marked by the calibration lines of refining. She held it up with both hands, not for the lawyers, but for the people. This, she said softly, is not a metaphor. Not a proposal, not a policy. She turned it slowly, the engraved seal catching a glint of courtroom light. This is proof. A piece of earth taken without consent, melted in silence, and stamped with someone else's name. She looked at the defense table. You call it investment. She raised the bar slightly. I call it theft refined and disguised as opportunity. You melted not just rock, but entire villages. You didn't build, you buried. Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened, every word landing with weight. This bar was meant to sit in a vault across an ocean. But now it sits here in front of those who paid its price without ever knowing it had a price at all. The courtroom was silent. Not even the scribes moved. The gold bar now resting on the evidence table seemed heavier than before, not just in weight but in meaning, because it wasn't just metal anymore. It was memory pressed into form. The courtroom stood still, as if holding its breath for one final moment. The clerk read the verdict aloud, voice unwavering, syllables deliberate. Guilty on all counts. No cheers erupted, no fists raised. But something deeper passed through the air, a release like tension unwinding from a nation's shoulders. It wasn't a celebration, it was recognition. That after years of whispers and disappearances, someone had named the wound correctly, and the room had answered. The 5 executives stood in stunned silence. One swayed slightly, another lowered his eyes for the first time during the entire trial. The lawyers shuffled their papers, already thinking of appeals that no one would listen to. Madame Kita remained seated. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She simply exhaled slowly, like someone who had waited 12 years to breathe in truth again. Outside, in the warm light of late afternoon, villagers and workers and elders gathered in quiet clusters beneath neem trees and rusted tin roofs. There were no banners, no speeches. Instead, someone began to sing. A lullaby. Soft and familiar, once used to lull babies to sleep or to guide the rhythm of hands planting in dry fields. Others joined in, their voices layering gently like woven cloth, old cracked beautiful. It was not a victory song, it was a homecoming. At the edge of the crowd, a grandmother sat cross-legged in the dust, her grandson curled beside her, tugging at her sleeve. Did he win a war? Grandmama? She looked down, brushing the dust from his cheek. No, she said, voice quiet. He didn't fight a war. She looked up toward the courthouse, toward the windows still glowing with late sun. But he won one. The National Hall was full, presidents, generals, ministers. Sadhu stood alone at the podium, the country's highest medal in a velvet box, waiting to be pinned on his chest. He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. I wasn't alone. I never was. He stepped off the stage and into the crowd, scanning rows of silent faces. Near the back, a small boy sat in a wheelchair, one leg braced with bamboo slats. Sadhu knelt before him. Here, he whispered, placing the medal in the boy's hand. Hold it until you're ready to walk your own path. Make sure the road is better than mine. The cameras didn't catch applause, just a still image of the boy holding the medal to his chest, eyes wide, lips trembling. That photo would be reprinted across the nation, captioned with only 5 words. He passed it forward quietly. Weeks later, trucks rolled into Sadhu's forgotten village. But this time, they didn't come for gold. They came carrying bricks, pipes, chalkboards, seeds, books. They came not to take but to build. Children ran alongside the convoys laughing. Elders watched from shaded stoops, disbelief mixing with something older, healing. A plaque was mounted at the foot of the new school, facing the rising sun, for those who limped forward when others ran away. Madame Kita visited once, walking the red dirt paths with Sadhu. "Truth takes root slowly," she said, touching the carved plaque. Sadhu smiled. "But it holds." In the newly built classroom, the first lesson was not math or grammar. It was a story about a boy who walked without needing to be loud. Years passed. The land changed. The old gold fields were now planted with mahogany trees and gardens. A school stood where convoys once loaded stolen crates. The wind no longer carried ash, just chalk dust and laughter. Sadhu walked those paths often, never in uniform, always in silence. People greeted him with nods, not titles. One morning as he crossed the hill behind the school, he saw a boy on crutches beside a tree. The boy didn't speak. He simply nodded the same way Sadhu once had when words were too small for what needed to be carried. They stood together for a moment, watching the field sway in quiet rhythm. And as the screen faded to black, the final line appeared. He walked forward when the road was made of fire. This story isn't just about gold or borders. It's about the kind of courage that doesn't roar. It's about a boy named Sadhu, overlooked and underestimated, who chose listening over shouting, maps over medals, and truth over applause. In a world that often celebrates noise and power, Sadhu's journey reminds us that real strength can grow in silence, and that change often begins not with grand speeches, but with quiet steps taken in the right direction. What moved me most was how justice here wasn't a single heroic moment, but a slow, painful, persistent journey. The gold trucks, the courtroom, the threats, they're symbols of systems that have failed so many for so long. And yet, in the midst of corruption and fear, Sadhu didn't just survive, he stood. Not because he was the strongest, but because he was willing to carry the truth even when it was heavy, even when it burned. This story also honors the power of legacy. Isufu's lessons, Kita's resilience. The voices of villagers, none of them were loud, but all of them mattered. In the end, it wasn't just a verdict that changed a nation, but the collective memory of those who refused to forget. Sadhu didn't win a war with weapons. He won it with integrity. And maybe that's what we need more of, people willing to walk forward when the road is made of fire. So now I ask you, when the world is loud, will you have the courage to be quietly brave? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.